Don't go ahead. Stepanich lifted his shot glass. No clinking. The gamekeeper exhaled, downed his shot, grimaced, and chased it with baked potatoes from the fire. Ilya, hesitating slightly, followed his example. The vodka burned through him, heat spread through his body, scorching away his sorrow and melancholy. Ilya stretched out his legs, settling more comfortably on the log. Stepanich sat opposite on a stump, chewing potatoes and staring thoughtfully into the fire. Yellow reflections danced in the old man's bleary eyes. Ilya realized that the gamekeeper had hardly changed in the 7 years since they last met. His beard still stuck out in the same way, and deep wrinkles cut across his weathered face. Ilya looked away. Evening shadows thickened among the juniper bushes, and tall dark firs loomed behind them. Twilight spread from the forest, ready to engulf the tent pitched near the fire. "You shouldn't have come." Stepanich broke the silence. "Why?" Ilya was surprised. It's the anniversary. His heart clenched with memories. 5 years ago, his father, an avid hunter and Stepanich's old friend, went missing in this forest. The search yielded nothing. His father seemed to have vanished, leaving behind a tent with his belongings and a boat on the riverbank. As a child, Ilya often went hunting with his father. It was one of the few things that connected them. But after his father's disappearance, any thought of the forest repelled him. This year, something changed. The pain of loss subsided, and Ilya felt an urgent desire to see the places where his father had disappeared, to honor his memory. "You shouldn't have come today," Stepanich explained, staring unblinkingly at him. "Tonight will be a red night." "What do you mean?" Ilya asked, pouring vodka into the glasses. Stepanich squinted and rocked slightly on the stump, looking towards the dark forest, over which heavy clouds were gathering. It was stuffy, and the air smelled of ozone. A storm was approaching. Every 5 years it happens before a red night. The shapeshifters appear. Ilya handed the shot glass to the gamekeeper. Stepanich downed the vodka in one gulp. He didn't chase it with anything. Hunching his shoulders, he stared at the fire with a glassy gaze. From past hunting trips with his father, as a child, Ilya remembered that the gamekeeper got drunk quickly. A couple more shots, and the old man would pass out. "My father once mentioned some shapeshifters, but I thought they were just hunting stories." Ilya didn't particularly want to listen to the gamekeeper's drunken ramblings, but no other conversation topics seemed to work. What do these shapeshifters look like? Like different animals, as if they were torn apart and then pieced together haphazardly. Stepanich slurred. "You walk through the forest. Suddenly there's a moose in front of you. But it's not a moose. It's some freak. Its legs are twisted, its head grows out of its back, and its antlers stick out of its belly. But I've seen other shapeshifters, hares, boars, foxes. I've seen all kinds. They wheeze, they groan. They can't stand on their twisted legs. And what did you do with them? What do you think?" Stepanich grimaced. "I shot them to put them out of their misery, then threw them into the swamp. Some of them were aggressive, could attack. The strangest thing is that at night, when they appear, strange things happen. The sky is covered with a red veil. The air hums as if charged. A storm hits. Everything trembles and vibrates. And such a night will be tonight." Ilya, adding wood to the fire, glanced at the sky-gray. Clouds were streaked with crimson, like dirty cotton balls soaked in blood. The air was still and absorbed all sounds. The wind, the rustling leaves, the birds' songs, everything disappeared, leaving Ilya alone with the quiet voice of the drunken gamekeeper. "I saw a shapeshifter while I was coming to you," Stepanich said. "A squealing sack with limbs, head, and tail sticking out haphazardly. Only by the red fur did I guess it used to be a fox. Terrible how it was mangled. I wanted to shoot the freak, but it crawled into the bushes. Never mind, I'll find it tomorrow. Shapeshifters don't hide for long. Where do they come from?" "No one knows." Stepanich shrugged and pulled a cigarette from a crumpled pack. There used to be a settlement nearby, and the locals said this forest is cursed. People have been disappearing here for ages. Villagers avoided the thicket unless necessary, and were especially wary of open glades. I sometimes notice strange things too. You walk through the forest, familiar places, and suddenly you see a clearing that wasn't there before. And the next day you pass by, and it's gone, disappeared. Stepanich fell silent and lit his cigarette. When I went hunting with my father, we never came across such clearings. Ilya, suppressing a smirk, poured vodka and handed a shot to the gamekeeper. I told you it doesn't always happen. Stepanich drank and grimaced, taking a drag on his cigarette. You and your father came here a couple of times a year, but I've been here my whole life. The gamekeeper exhaled smoke through his nose. Gray tendrils hung in the air, forming intricate shapes. Dusk gathered around the fire. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Ilya, there's one more thing. Stepanich broke the silence. He looked away and stared at the fire. Your father disappeared on a red night. I've never told anyone this before. Who would have believed me? Ilya tensed, his mouth went dry, and his heart pounded in his chest. Everything he knew about his father's disappearance was based on reports from the search team leader and the police investigator, but none of them mentioned any supernatural events. Stepanich's words were a revelation. Tell me. He breathed out. In the evening, we were drinking by the fire with Igor. He had just returned from hunting, having shot 2 boars. We were telling stories, laughing. A storm was approaching. The sky was turning red, but we didn't notice because of the booze. And then a shapeshifter burst out of the forest. Stepanich paused to take a drag. The cigarette trembled in his hand. The gamekeeper's eyes welled up with tears. It was unusual. The old man continued hoarsely. I had never seen one like it before. It was a human shapeshifter, naked, covered in mud, legs instead of arms, arms instead of legs. The head dangled on its back, but it was all distorted too. A mouth gaped on its forehead, eyes stared from its cheeks, and its nose was pressed inwards, a black hole in its place. The freak was trembling from fear or cold. I don't know. It was mumbling something, then suddenly screamed. Igor jumped up, probably scared, and shot it with his rifle. Hit the shapeshifter in the side. It fell instantly. We dragged it to the swamp and left it there. Just then the downpour started. Everything glowed red, and the trees hummed like transformers. I suggested Igor spend the night in my cabin, but he refused and went to his tent. And that's how he vanished. Ash fell from the cigarette's tip, and Stepanich flicked the butt into the fire. Ilya sat as if stunned. He didn't know whether to believe what he'd heard. The gamekeeper's revelation sounded like the drunken ramblings of an old hermit, but it could also be the key to his father's disappearance. And who was that human shapeshifter? I don't know. Stepanich shrugged and looked towards the forest. But one thing bothers me. What if your father disappeared because of it? Ilya couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in his sleeping bag, going over old memories and new facts in his mind too incredible to believe. Stepanich had left for the ranger's cabin about an hour ago, citing the approaching storm and the need to wait it out in shelter. The old man had recalled the villager's words on a red night: one should not venture into the forest. But Ilya was already in the forest, and his refuge was his father's worn-out tent. Stepanich had urged Ilya to come to his cabin, but the prospect of spending the night in a room with a snoring man, breathing in the acrid smell of alcohol, was not appealing. His head was already splitting from the alcohol, the stuffiness, and the gamekeeper's wild story. Ilya wanted to be alone with his memories and his guilt. 5 years ago, his father had invited him on a hunting trip. "Come on, son, let's go one more time." "We haven't been to the forest in a while," he said. Ilya had declined, though he couldn't remember the reason now. Perhaps it was a work deadline or a party with friends. It didn't matter anymore. The nagging thought had been gnawing at him for years. If he had gone hunting with his father, the tragedy might not have happened. Outside, somewhere deep in the forest, a branch snapped. From past trips, he remembered that the wild was always filled with sounds at any time of day. But this night was unusually quiet. As if frozen in the sultry pre-storm air, there was no sound of crickets, no hooting of owls, no rustling of leaves. Ilya thought the snap of the branch was just his imagination when suddenly something rustled a few meters from the tent. He unzipped the sleeping bag, half crawled out, and propped himself up on one arm, turning his head towards the sound. The rustling grew closer. It seemed as if something was slowly crawling through the dry grass towards the tent. But what could it be? Ilya recalled the local fauna: foxes, boars, hares, moose, wolverines, squirrels, otters, ducks, geese, vipers. What else had he and his father seen? None of these animals moved with the sound of a dragging sack, and most of them slept at night, except perhaps for foxes, which were now hunting. But it would have to be a very careless fox to approach its prey so noisily. Maybe it wasn't a fox, but its shapeshifter, as Stepanik had seen today. Hence the strange, loud sounds. While Ilya was thinking, the rustling stopped. Maybe it was just his imagination? He could have mistaken it for the crackling of the dying embers in the fire, although Stepanik had put out the fire with water before leaving, as a good gamekeeper should. Ilya smirked, amazed at his own impressionability, and shook his head. He needed to stop listening to crazy tales. Just as he was about to lay back on his pillow, a quiet, drawn-out moan sounded from outside. His heart raced, and his body was enveloped in a damp chill, as if Ilya had fallen into an ice hole. He swallowed thick saliva and fully emerged from the sleeping bag, trying not to make any noise. His hand found cold metal, a rifle. Sleep with the carbine Stepanik had advised when Ilya had flatly refused to spend the night in the ranger's cabin. And now the old man's advice was timely. Whatever beast was moaning outside the tent, it stood little chance against Lead. Ilya grabbed the rifle and crept to the ventilation window, covered with mosquito netting. He peered out. The clearing where he had set up camp was bathed in a crimson twilight. The trees, usually black at night, now seemed smeared with dark blood, and the trampled ground, recently a dull gray, had turned brown. But where did these strange shades come from? The sunset had already passed, and the sky was overcast. Could Stepanik be right about the red night approaching? Ilya's head spun, and he realized he had held his breath for too long while listening. He inhaled the dry, electrified air. A moan echoed across the clearing. It came from somewhere to the left, beyond the window's view. Squinting, Ilya tried to see something in the twilight, struggling to make out anything beyond the thicket of trees and bushes. The moaning was joined by a quiet grunting, or whimpering sound, as if someone was struggling with a heavy burden, pain, or a hangover. A sudden realization struck Ilya Stepanik. It seemed the gamekeeper had indeed had too much to drink, and was now wandering through the forest, suffering from nausea. "Hey, who's that drunken wanderer?" Ilya shouted. He expected to hear the familiar raspy voice, but instead, a guttural moan came from the clearing, followed by the clattering of an overturned pot. What the hell is going on out there? Ilya grabbed his flashlight and directed the beam towards the window. The cone of light sliced through the dark clearing, illuminating a pale figure near the stump where the pot lay overturned. Ilya's breath caught in his throat. In the pale light of the flashlight, a creature was trembling, naked, angular, and covered in mud. It took Ilya a few moments to realize it was a human, but a strange, horrifying, unnatural human. At first glance, it seemed to be in a backbend position, with limbs touching the ground. But on closer inspection, Ilya realized with horror that the person was on all fours, with legs growing from the shoulders, bent like a grasshopper's, and thin arms extending from the buttocks. The limbs had swapped places. The creature swayed unsteadily on them, struggling to stand. There was no head. Or rather, it wasn't where a head should be. A gaping wound, oozing some slimy substance, lay where the neck should have been. The head protruded from the middle of the back, like a camel's hump. Ilya didn't have time to examine the face. The shapeshifter, swaying, moved and awkwardly shuffled towards the tent, making ghastly sounds, wheezing, guttural, clipped like it was trying to say something but couldn't. A cold sweat broke out on Ilya, followed by a wave of heat. He was shaking as if he'd grabbed a live wire. The flashlight fell from his hands, and he recoiled from the window. The sound of rustling the shapeshifter was hastily approaching the entrance. Ilya grabbed his gun, and trying to steady his trembling hands, aimed at the tent flap. What kind of monster is this? The uncertain footsteps grew closer, and a terrifying thought pierced Ilya's mind. What if this was the same shapeshifter that caused his father's death? The description matched perfectly. Stepanich had said these creatures could be aggressive, attacking people. What if the shapeshifter his father shot had crawled out of the swamp and attacked him? And now it had come for Ilya. His throat tightened, and Ilya opened his mouth, noisily sucking in the hot air. The guttural moaning and the rustling steps were right at the tent entrance. Ilya gripped the forend tighter, but the gun still trembled in his hands. The flashlight lay on the sleeping bag, casting an oblique beam of light. The tent flap moved, and the twisted figure of the shapeshifter appeared in the doorway first, bent knees, then the neck wound oozing pus, and finally the torso with the swaying, slightly askew head. A curved mouth with a lolling tongue cut across the forehead, that's all Ilya managed to see. In the next moment, the tent shook, thunder exploded in the sky. The blast was so loud that Ilya jumped in fright. His finger jerking the trigger, the shot boomed, blinding Ilya with the flash. The recoil threw him back, and the gun fell from his hands. His ears rang. Ilya found the rifle, grabbed the flashlight, and shone it at the entrance. The shapeshifter was gone. Rain began to drum on the canvas. Quickly pulling on his boots, Ilya stepped outside. The rain lashed his face, his clothes instantly soaked. Near the tent, in a bubbling puddle, lay the shapeshifter on its right side. Ilya, aiming the gun, cautiously approached and shone the flashlight on the sprawled body. On the left shoulder of the creature, where a human's arms would begin, but a leg grew instead, was a round entry wound from the shot, with a trickle of blood seeping from the singed edge. Ilya peered closer. It seemed the creature wasn't breathing, and it looked like he had killed it. Just in case, Ilya kicked the creature with his boot. The body swayed but remained motionless. With the gun barrel, Ilya rolled the creature onto its stomach to get a better look at its head, grotesquely protruding from its back. He shuddered in disgust. The face of the shapeshifter was an unimaginable mess of organs and body parts. A mouth gaped open on the forehead, with a swollen tongue hanging out. Instead of eyes, there were two raised bumps, and after a closer look, Ilya realized they were nipples, surrounded by sparse hair. There were no eyebrows. The nose was a shriveled lump of skin, sunken into the head, and it took Ilya a moment to recognize it as a navel. The upper and lower jaws were covered with a leathery texture. The hairline started closer to the nape, making it seem like the wet hair had slipped back on the bald head like a wig. But where were the eyes? Ilya turned the monster's head with the gun barrel. Where the left ear should have been, a glassy eye stared back at him, with swollen, dumpling-like eyelids. Stifling a gag reflex, Ilya tilted the head to the other side. The second eye, swollen, cloudy, and bloodshot, was where the right ear should have been. And now what? Whoever this freak was, he mostly looked like a human, and Ilya had just shot him. Killed a human, even if a deranged one. Trembling, Ilya looked up at the sky in desperation, where the rain was pouring down in an endless stream. The firmament above was covered with crimson clouds, through which a pulsating scarlet glow seeped. Ilya suddenly realized that the same blood-red glow filled the entire space around him. It enveloped the trees and bushes, spread across the ground, saturated the air, and reflected in the puddles. It seemed like blood was pouring from the sky, not water. Ilya slung the rifle over his shoulder and grabbed the shapeshifter by its bare leg. The skin was cold and slippery. Panting with effort, Ilya dragged the creature towards the forest. Fortunately, It was easy to pull over the wet grass. Nothing else came to mind but to drown the creature in the swamp. After all, that's what Stepanich had been doing with shapeshifters for years, and it didn't matter if they were beasts or subhumans. One thing Ilya knew for sure: these horrific abominations shouldn't walk the earth. They surely posed a danger. Just remember how boldly the shapeshifter entered his tent. The thought that he had shot the creature responsible for his father's disappearance brought him some peace. Ilya convinced himself he was doing the right thing. After all, he wasn't going to the police with the body of a mutant, was he? He would dispose of the horrific monster and forget about this nightmare forever. Ilya dragged the body to the edge of the clearing. Dense undergrowth began here, with a barely visible path winding through it like a scar, hardly noticeable in the red twilight. Ilya remembered that it led to the ranger's cabin, passing by the marshy areas. If he deviated from the path and went deeper into the undergrowth to the right, he would soon reach the swamps. That was where he needed to go. Slinging the rifle over his chest, Ilya hoisted the bony body of the monster onto his shoulders. The load was heavy, although the freak didn't look massive. Battling his disgust, Ilya imagined he was carrying a hefty boar he had shot. Slipping in his boots on the wet path, muttering curses under his breath, Ilya, with the shapeshifter on his shoulders, plunged into the thicket. The rain didn't let up. It was falling from the sky in a vertical wall, as if intending to wash the cursed forest off the face of the earth. Above his head, red flashed. Was it lightning or mysterious light through the clouds? Ilya couldn't tell. Water streamed from his hair across his face, making it hard to see the way. The fir forest was humming, and at first Ilya took it for wind, until he noticed that the air, sliced by the straight lines of rain, was absolutely still. Ilya stopped and listened. The monotonous hum surrounded him from all sides. It felt as if mighty trees had been electrified and now vibrated, unable to contain the growing tension. The ground beneath his feet trembled slightly, deep and distant. The vibrations seemed to come from the earth's very depths. The load on his shoulders twitched. Ilya froze. Could the shapeshifter be alive? He turned his head back, straining to see any movement in the body behind him, but the freak hung limply, repositioning it more comfortably. Ilya left the path and, pushing through the thickets of buckthorn, headed towards the swamps. Soon the ground squelched underfoot. His boots bounced on mossy hummocks and sank ankle-deep into murky puddles. The bushes thinned out and then disappeared altogether, revealing a vast swamp. Like everything else around, its color was an unnatural shade of red. To Ilya, it seemed like he was facing a dense, blood-like sludge. He dropped the shapeshifter off his shoulders. The freak fell into the thick mire with a slap and let out a loud moan. Ilya jumped back in fright and grabbed his rifle. He aimed it at the creature, but soon lowered it. The creature was quietly moaning, but doing nothing else. The monster, limbs sprawled, lay on its stomach, and its head on the limp neck dangled lifelessly from its back. The swollen eye on the left temple roamed around and then focused on Ilya. It fixated. The shapeshifter moaned in terror, staring at Ilya with its one eye. The lips on its forehead twitched in grotesque spasms, as if trying to say something, but the swollen, blackened tongue hindered the creature from forming words from its guttural, staccato sounds. Ilya couldn't take it anymore. He confidently approached the freak and kicked it in the belly, pushing it into the swamp. The shapeshifter, shrieking, rolled onto its side, the head growing out of its back, preventing it from falling onto its back. Ilya squatted near the creature and, grimacing in disgust, used his hands to shove it into the mire. With a resounding plop, the viscous sludge enveloped the shapeshifter, slowly and irreversibly pulling it under. The monster's head rose above the surface, swiveling as if trying to grasp something, or catch Ilya's gaze. The shapeshifter groaned with its skewed mouth on its forehead and rolled its eyes scattered across its temples. Engaidi. Angi. Nah. Plenu, the creature croaked desperately, and in its torn voice Ilya heard pleading tones. Soon it was over. The swampy mire closed over the creature's forehead. Its mouth, disappearing last emitted a dying sound, and Ilya shuddered. It seemed like the freak had said the word clearing. What clearing? The swamp bubbled, where the shapeshifter had vanished, then quieted, turning into a murky jelly pounded by the rain. Ilya straightened up. He caught his breath, calmed down, and trudged back through the thicket to the path leading to his tent. His vision blurred, and his legs felt weak. Trees loomed ahead, and Ilya plunged into the forest, pushing through the sprawling branches of the firs. Where was the path? The ground trembled noticeably underfoot. It felt as if the vibration, pulsing deep within the earth, now sought to break free. The glow from the sky was saturated with blood, and the entire world around him seemed to be viewed through a red filter. There was a humming now, not only from the trees but also inside his head. The fir grove abruptly ended, and a grassy clearing spread out at his feet. Where did it come from? A light mist, shimmering with a crimson glow, drifted across the clearing. At the opposite edge, Ilya spotted the path. He saw it cut through the forest and disappeared into the undergrowth. He turned around. The forest behind him was shrouded in a crimson fog. What should he do? Turn back to the swamp and try to find another way, or cross the clearing and finally reach the path? Ilya was fed up with all this hellishness. He wanted to get to his tent as quickly as possible, fall asleep, and leave these cursed places forever in the morning. Nothing was keeping him here any longer. Determined, Ilya stepped into the clearing and quickly walked through the wet grass toward the opposite edge, where the path beckoned. A fox suddenly darted out in front of him. It froze, ears and tail tucked, staring at him with wide, frightened eyes. The next moment, the ground flipped beneath his feet. Ilya was thrown into the air and landed with a heavy thud on the damp grass. The previously monotonous hum swelled and pulsed in time with the flashes of red light. His vision was veiled in a bloody haze, and then darkness fell. Ilya opened his eyes. His vision was blurry and unsteady, making it impossible to focus. The images from each retina wouldn't align. Finally, he figured out to close one eye. The scene came into focus. He was lying on the ground, looking at the same clearing. A bit further away, the fir thicket loomed darkly, and the path leading into the forest was visible. The rain had stopped. The air, filled with a red glow, was dry and hot, like before a storm. Grass and clumps of earth pricked his body, and Ilya realized he was lying in the clearing completely naked. Where are my clothes? Ilya moved his arm. His shoulder responded with sharp, piercing pain, but instead of his arm, a leg came into view. A chill ran down his spine and prickled his neck much earlier than Ilya was used to. He lifted his head and looked around. A scream of horror stuck in his throat. Ilya's head was now in the middle of his back. His naked body ended abruptly where his neck used to be. Instead of arms, legs sprawled on the ground, and where his legs used to be, arms now grew from his buttocks. He had turned into a shapeshifter. Ilya opened his other eye, and his vision blurred again. He groaned, and then broke into a scream. This desperate, terrified sound came from his forehead, where his mouth now was. Tears sprang from his eyes and flowed down his neck, as if salty liquid was seeping from his ears. Ilya tried to bring his hands to his face, but instead his legs moved, growing from his shoulders. For several minutes, he learned to coordinate the movements of his mixed-up limbs to touch his face with his palms. He had to move the joints of his lower body, where his arms now grew. If Ilya wanted to move his legs, his brain needed to send a command to his shoulder girdle where his arms used to be. Each muscle contraction was met with sharp pain. Ilya imagined an invisible surgeon, or rather, a butcher had chopped him up and then sewn him back together haphazardly, without anesthesia. Bending, he touched his face with his right-hand foot. His fears were confirmed where his eye sockets had been. He found nipples. A soft navel like depression had replaced his nose, and his eyes were spread across the sides of his head. He waved a hand in front of each eye in turn. He felt his crown, the back of his head, and finally found his ears on the back of his neck. When he touched them with his fingers, the sounds of the outside world muted. There were no ear flaps. Ilya took a deep breath with his mouth. He didn't know where his nose was now, or if he even had one. Trying to calm himself and stop the nervous trembling, he had to do something. It was unclear how long he had been lying in the clearing. The rain had stopped, the grass and earth had dried, but dawn had not yet come. The night sky was still covered by that same reddish haze. Strange, could the soil and thickets have dried so quickly after such a heavy downpour? Ilya rose on his trembling limbs. His legs, bent at the knees, stuck out in front of his torso, and his elbows jutted backward. Standing was uncomfortable, his body shook and threatened to fall. Ilya took a few tentative steps and collapsed onto the grass, crying out in pain. On his third attempt, he maintained his balance. Then, cautiously, with clenched teeth, he hobbled toward the path at the edge of the clearing. His goal was simple: get to the tent as quickly as possible and use the satellite phone to call for help. The grass tickled his belly. His mud-smeared limbs stumbled on the uneven path, but Ilya, groaning, persevered. When the pain in his newly configured joints became unbearable, he took a short break and then continued, pushing through the undergrowth. Finally, the thicket parted, and the clearing with the tent beside the extinguished fire came into view. Ilya exhaled in relief. He was almost there, just a little further. His limbs shook with fatigue, ready to betray him by collapsing. Just a bit more. He took a step and stepped on a dry branch. It snapped loudly. In the same instant, his strength abandoned him, and he collapsed onto his bent limbs. Falling so close to the tent with the satellite phone was frustrating and foolish, so Ilya, gritting his teeth and enduring the pain, crawled on his belly, pushing with his arms behind and pulling with his legs in front, dragging his torso along. His body, stretching, responded with pulsating pain in its abnormal joints, and Ilya groaned loudly. Grunting and moaning through clenched teeth, he dragged himself toward the tent over the dry, rustling grass. "Hey, who's that stumbling around drunk?" barked a sharp, vaguely familiar voice. Ilya froze. Someone was inside. Could it be Stepanich? Had he come looking for him? Ilya opened his mouth to call for help, but a guttural mooing sound came from his forehead. He broke into a sweat. He couldn't speak. Ilya, trembling, rose on his shaky limbs to hasten toward the tent, but overestimated his strength and fell onto a stump with a kettle left on it. The fallen kettle clanged to the ground. In the next moment, a bright light flashed across his body. A flashlight beam shone from the tent window. Blinded by the bright light, Ilya trembled in place, struggling to stay on his unsteady limbs. He rasped, trying to utter any word, and, swaying, moved toward the tent entrance, circling it from the side. The flashlight beam disappeared from the window, and now shone from inside, at the bottom of the tent. It grew darker, lifting his head. Ilya saw with his side eye how crimson clouds gathered in the sky, ready to unleash torrents of water. Groaning, Ilya hobbled to the tent entrance. He slipped his legs inside, then pulled his torso and head, ending up in the hot, dimly lit interior, cut by the flashlight beam. Thunder roared from the sky, and in the next instant, a gunshot and a bright flash exploded before Ilya. His left shoulder burned with a powerful impact. He was thrown from the tent onto the clearing, and cold raindrops began to pelt his body. He woke up to the red light. Crimson flashes flickered before his eyes, and at first, Ilya thought they were just the pulse of blood under his eyelids. Focusing his vision, he realized the liquid glow was spilling from the sky, a flashing forest. A guttural hum, vibrating trees, shaking steps, streams of rain, wetness on his body, blood on his shoulder, burning pain. His senses, though scattered haphazardly across his body, gradually collected information from his surroundings and his own condition. Soon, Ilya pieced together the full picture. Wounded, he was being carried over someone's shoulders like the carcass of a hunted animal, just as he had recently carried the shapeshifter on his back. A chill ran through his body, and Ilya shuddered involuntarily. The person carrying him stopped and listened. Ilya froze, unsure of what to do, respond or remain silent. After a moment, the person resumed walking, and the branches of the fir trees scratched Ilya's naked body. The pain in his left shoulder spread in burning waves through his torso, pulsed in his head, and at some point became so unbearable that Ilya lost consciousness. A jolt brought him back to his senses. Ilya groaned, feeling the cold, greasy mire beneath him. He lay on his stomach, his limbs sprawled out. The air reeked of mud and the stagnant stench of the swamp. His head hung from his back, and he couldn't lift it. His strength had left him, along with the blood pouring from his gunshot shoulder. He opened one eye and looked around. The crimson sky and dark thickets in the distance swam into view. His gaze settled on a pair of boots, and he looked up. In front of him stood his double, a perfect replica of Ilya. Rain lashed at the face, twisted in disgust, red flashes reflecting in wide black pupils. Ilya moaned in horror. In an instant, equal to a lightning flash, the pieces of the puzzle fell into place in his mind. He had unraveled the mystery of the Red Knight. Somehow, incredibly, whether due to a space-time anomaly or some other bizarre occurrence, he had been thrown back in time by a few hours in that mysterious, inexplicable clearing. Evidently, such throws had happened in the forest before. Their victims were usually animals, and 5 years ago, his father had fallen into the trap. Instant spatial jumps did not go without consequences, and involuntary time travelers returned to the past deformed as shapeshifters. His father had turned into a shapeshifter. Ilya had become a shapeshifter, and he knew how it would end. The double stepped closer and kicked Ilya in the stomach, pushing him toward the swamp. Ilya cried out, collapsing onto his side. The head sticking out of his back prevented him from lying flat. The double crouched beside him and shoved him into the swamp. The dense, cold muck closed around his body, pulling him down. Ilya couldn't move. The viscous sludge bound his already weakened limbs. He could only thrash his head above the swamp's surface, gasping for air and choking on the foul slurry. "Don't go to the clearing," Ilya tried to shout, but only torn, bubbling sounds came from his forehead. His eyes were covered in murky slime, but his mouth remained above the swamp. The clearing, Ilya gasped with his last breath, but he already knew his double himself wouldn't understand the warning. Darkness engulfed Ilya and dragged him to the bottom, where his father awaited him.